Hey, cutie pie. Oh, you're so cute. Oh, you're so cute. So I've really been referring to this sweater as my redemption sweater, my husband redemption sweater, because so many things went wrong in my first attempt at knitting him a sweater. And I'm really determined not to make the same mistakes again. It really just came down to not doing a proper gauge swatch and not measuring my husband. So I think one of the biggest things I'm doing for this project that I did not do at my first attempt was I took my husband's measurements, and I am not hiding this project from him. So my first attempt, I thought it would be cool to do it completely in secret, and it's a cool idea, and I hope to be able to do that at some point in the future, but I need to have a solid baseline for something like that to be successful. So I have his detailed measurements. I took his chest measurement, his waist, his hips, his bicep, the width between his shoulders at the back, his actual shoulder circumference. And I also measured from the base of his neck to where his sweaters tend to hit. And I made note of all of those measurements before getting started because it helped me choose which size I would be making. And because the sweater is bottom up, it also helped me figure out, okay, how long do I need to make the body? One thing that became kind of immediately apparent to me is that this project will be a lot of stockinette. Sometimes I'm in the mood for stockinette. Most times I want something a little more interesting to keep me engaged. Love cables and any type of knitting and purling texture, or just something that is not just stockinette in the round. Even stockinette flat, I tend to enjoy more than stockinette in the round because every row I'm turning my work and I'm doing something a little bit different than I did on the last row. Whereas stockinette in the round, I'm just knitting and knitting and knitting for miles on end. And that can be a little bit numbing. It can make for a boring knitting experience. So, and the last garment I made before casting this sweater on was my book club cardigan. That was the last big project that I completed. And if you're familiar with the pattern, that is all over cabled, inset pockets, lots of texture, lots of interesting things happening. And it was a night and day knitting experience than this project is turning out to be, which is to be expected, but I kind of wish I would have eased myself into committing to such a big, boring project. The other thing that became apparent to me fairly early on with this project is that the hem is rolling up. And granted, I haven't blocked it yet, but my real concern is that even after blocking, it will sort of revert back to curling up at the hem as he wears the sweater. And I really don't want that to happen, but I've already resolved to do sweater surgery if that does end up being a problem. Obviously, I'm casting on with the hem, so it was the first thing I noticed about this pattern. A 4x1 rib at the hem instead of maybe a 2x2 or a 1x1 or even a 2x1. All of those I've done for the trim of a sweater, but I haven't done a 4x1. And when I say 4x1, I mean 4 knits, 1 purl. It's essentially stockinette. The knit to purl ratio is so high that the fabric behaves more like stockinette than it does ribbing, which is why I'm experiencing the rolling. And so I'll just have to decide once it's complete and he's able to wear it. And I think maybe if I had used a fiber that was not mostly synthetic, like maybe this wouldn't be as much of an issue. My motto these days is we knit and we learn. So that's exactly what I'm doing with this project. I'm also playing a bit of a game with myself. So as I'm recording this section, I guess, it is Friday, October 11th. And I started the day and I needed to knit 5 more inches before the body was complete. And I have a unofficial goal of finishing the body this weekend. I'm taking a trip for work to California. For me, that's going to be a 4-hour flight. I would love to be done with the body so that I can cast on a sleeve and take a sleeve with me as my travel knitting for that trip. I'm on my 7th round of today. Let's just say I have 8 rounds left to knit. I think I can do that. I'm happy to report that I successfully finished the body before that work trip I mentioned. And it took me about a week, less than a week to finish the first sleeve. Also, less than a week to finish the second sleeve. So I'm 3.5 rounds away from finishing sleeve number 2. The sleeves in general, given the work travel that I've been doing, they have made for the perfect travel knitting. They're basically socks, super compact to take on a flight, on a long drive, anything like that. So kind of worked out perfectly because I was initially thinking I would cast on a new sock or a hat or something else portable and quick. But the sleeve knitting has turned out to be the perfect travel companion. I'm a little nervous for what is to come because that's the thing about a bottom-up sweater is that all the fiddly bits and the shaping and the special instructions are happening at pretty much the tail end of the project. If I were to knit this same project top down instead, my knitting experience will be kind of reversed in that regard because I would start off with all the shaping and fiddly bits and then I would kind of be smooth sailing at the tail end of the project. I don't think that's a good or bad thing, but it is something to consider. I find that this project was really easy to cast on and get started, and I really appreciated having that motivation, that momentum on the front end. I'm also really nervous about the zipper. So there are a lot of things with this project I'm actually nervous about that have kind of been in my mind as I've been working through it. I think the fit is one of the things, but with all of the measurement and the gauge math that I did, I'm pretty confident that it will fit. But that's just in general something that is a concern of mine. But then I think the other thing I've been nervous about, and I mentioned before, is the hem and if it's going to continue to roll up and if blocking is truly going to help. But you know, I'm trying to get out of my head about all the things I'm worried about, and I'm trying to manifest a successful project that fits well and that he's going to love. Let us celebrate because sleeve 2 is done. So in a tragic turn of events, I have to rip out all of the progress I made yesterday because I'm 1 stitch off when I split the 2 fronts in half for the zipper. I am 1 stitch over from where I should be, so there's really no easy way to fix it. And I thought about sneaking in an increase on one side and a decrease on the other, but because it's right in front, there's really no discreet way to do that. And it's only a day's worth of work, which probably amounts to 2.5 hours in total. So it's not a huge amount of time, but there's something in the moment that just feels very daunting and discouraging about these situations. Like when I think about it in the grand scheme of the project, I've been working on this project now for several weeks. 1 day of progress over the course of an entire month is really not that bad. So I feel like in these moments I have to take my emotion out of it, because my past experience has told me that it is usually worth just going back, fixing a mistake, and just putting in the extra effort to make the finished object something that I'm proud of. It's not to say that I wouldn't be proud of it if I left the mistake in, or if I just went along with it knowing that the placket would be a 1 stitch off. In the grand scheme of mistakes, this is probably considered a minor one, but again, I know I would feel better if I just rip it out. And ripping the Band-Aid off for me is not, I'm just gonna set the project aside for a couple of days and come back to it. Those couple of days will be kind of agonizing because I know it'll be hanging over my head. So yeah, this is just a real-time documentation of one of the many lessons I learned in my knitting journey, and that is that ripping out is just, sometimes it's inevitable. But while we're here, I'll show you the progress that I have. So it's looking like a sweater. And this is the zipper opening that is 1 stitch off. So basically all of this is what I have to rip out, and it doesn't look like a lot, but I'm working with almost 300 stitches at this point, and each row is taking me a few minutes. So it's not an insignificant amount of progress across all of these stitches, but that's okay. That's okay. So I feel like I didn't document much, but obviously I made quite a bit of progress. So I was able to join the sleeves and the body. I did go back to the body and add some length, just because I measured it again and it wasn't quite what the schematic called for. So I think I ended the body a little bit prematurely. So I went back and added maybe 4 or 5 rows in total. So not a ton of length, but I did feel better about that. Like I felt like that was a good use of my time. I don't know how to get good filming angles, like POV filming angles. I think I need a special kind of tripod for that. A tripod that I don't own and probably won't be purchasing. Anyway, I have my waste yarn here on a tapestry needle, and I'm going to insert it just before where I bound off the stitches in the middle to create the button opening, or the zipper placket opening. So that's what I'm going to do, and I'm just going to pick up the the right leg of every stitch, and I'm going to go and do that around the entirety of the sweater, which is this is going to be so annoying. Oh my gosh. It's always a little difficult for me when I'm doing tasks like this. You kind of go cross-eyed at a certain point, and it's hard to tell if you are picking up the same row in every single stitch. And it doesn't help that this is a very dark yarn. I'm never really 100% certain that I am picking up the same row every single time. So yeah, joining The sleeves and the body on this project was really tedious and I didn't enjoy it one bit. I'm realizing that bottom up might not be my favorite, but I got through it. The weird thing was like for the sleeve stitches, they're still kind of restricted into a relatively tight circumference. I had to do a weird magic loop hybrid technique for that section. So yeah, because the sleeves were in still a relatively tight circumference, because I don't know how to explain it, but the pattern does give a tip. It says when you join the sleeves to the body, you will likely need to do some type of magic loop or small circumference technique at either sleeve, just so that you can work those stitches. So that was kind of tedious. And I had to do that for the first several rounds after joining the sleeves to the body. So it got really long and tedious, and I felt like my progress had grinded to a halt, because before joining, I was either working on the body or working on an individual sleeve, both of which have obviously a significantly less amount of stitches. So it just felt like I was progressing a lot faster in the first part of the project, as opposed to when I joined the sleeves and I suddenly had a ton of stitches to work with. It kind of felt like my progress grinded to a halt in a way. Ultimately, it was a minor setback because I made my progress back and completed the whole upper yoke in 2 days. I dedicated an entire weekend to making as much progress as I could, so it didn't feel like as much of a setback as it initially did. The nice thing is that I had caffeinating plans that weekend, so I was able to make up my lost progress while catching up with a friend at a local cafe, and it just made it a little bit easier to get through. I was struggling to understand the collar stitch pattern, so I inserted a lifeline before starting in case I needed to rip back. And from what I could tell, no one else on Ravelry mentioned having trouble with it, and everybody's collars looked nice, so I decided to trust the pattern and see where that got me. What is this supposed to be? After making some progress in the collar, I'm happy to report that the pattern revealed itself to me, and it looks exactly how the pictures do. In general, this pattern hasn't been the easiest to follow, and I think it comes down to 2 reasons. English is not the designer's first language. Some phrases are worded awkwardly, and I'm assuming some techniques get lost in translation, or perhaps German patterns follow a different standard of structure or wording. And the second reason is that this construction technique is totally unfamiliar to me and relatively complicated. So I think in general, this was going to be a challenge for me. And reading ahead, I'm really nervous about the zipper. Many knitters on Ravelry swapped the zipper for buttons, and they didn't even attempt the zipper placket. Other knitters' zippers looked pretty sloppy, if I'm honest, and I don't know if that's user technique or inadequate instructions. One knitter did mention that they had trouble picking up along the slip stitch edge to create the zipper placket. And I've had this issue before with slip stitches, and I probably should have known better and modified, but I was just blindly trusting the pattern because I'm trying several new techniques in this project and I didn't want to screw anything up. I just picked up stitches along the second side of the zipper placket. 2 out of every 3 rows. This was knit bottom up, so each stitch is a V this way, and if you can see, I picked up in the center of one of those V's instead of at the very edge where the slip stitch is, and this just allowed me to get a picker cleanup edge than I was getting on the first several attempts at the first zipper placket. So pretty smooth, no gaps. Now the next step will be to, on the wrong side, bring this needle over and pick up the same number of stitches along the back side of the pickup edge. So I have double the stitch count, and then I'll double knit for, I think, 10 rows, 5 rows on each side, and then do a tubular bind off. And visually it gives the same effect as the folded stockinette. I laid the sweater next to one of my husband's store-bought sweaters, and I noticed a pretty glaring issue that made me a little bit nervous. It is dramatically longer, mainly in the body, but the sleeves are also pretty long compared to the store-bought sweater as well. Now, I'm confident I can fix this with sweater surgery, so I'm not too worried about it. And the good news is that the circumference is pretty good. So my plan is to finish all of the knitting and blocking, and before weaving in any ends, I'll have him try it on so I can assess what fixes I need to do. I know I'll need to shorten the body, but once he tries it on, I'll be able to mark how short I need to take the body. Now it's time for the finishing details. The first thing I did was finish the second zipper placket. Then I steamed the upper yoke to flatten everything out and making it easier to neatly sew the zipper and sew down the folded collar. Next, it was time to sew in the zipper, but before I could sew in the zipper, I had to find the zipper. My first stop was Michael's, which is a big box craft store in the States that I happen to live near. But they didn't have any black zippers, and I didn't think the navy zipper I found would work. It also felt and looked a little bit cheap. But then I remembered there's a quilt shop near my house, so I took a walk there to see if they had any good options. Now, the zipper is the step I was most nervous about. So I did a bit of research, and I'll link the tutorial I found most helpful down in the description box.